Every conversation about World War II fighters follows the same script. Someone mentions the P-51 Mustang. Everyone nods. The sleek lines, the range, the Berlin escort missions. Consensus achieved, case closed. The Mustang is the American fighter of the war, and questioning that feels almost heretical. But there was another American fighter, one that brought pilots home when the Mustang would have killed them. One that came back from missions with cylinders blown out, control surfaces shredded, entire sections of wing missing, and still landed safely. German pilots learned quickly that you could hit a P-47 and hit it, and it would not go down. This plane was built to be resilient. You have probably heard of it. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug. But you have probably heard of it as a footnote, the supporting actor where the P-51 was the star. That relegation to secondary status is one of the great historical injustices in aviation history, because the numbers tell a very different story. 15,686 P-47 Thunderbolts were built during World War II, 15,586 P-51 Mustangs, 100 more Jugs than Mustangs, statistically identical production. And yet, when someone pictures an American fighter from the war, they picture the Mustang. The Jug, despite equal numbers, has been culturally erased. This is not an attack on the P-51. The Mustang was strategically essential in ways the P-47 never could have been. But this is an argument that the best fighter for keeping pilots alive and the most important fighter for winning the war were two completely different aircraft. So let us talk about what made the P-47 different. One fundamental design choice separated it from every other American fighter: the engine. The P-51 used the Packard V1650 Merlin, liquid-cooled, producing 1,490 horsepower. Legendary engine, smooth, powerful, efficient, vulnerable in exactly one way that killed pilots constantly. One bullet through the coolant system, one piece of shrapnel through the glycol lines, one cannon shell that nicked the radiator, and the Merlin would overheat and seize within minutes. The pilot had 2 or 3 minutes to find somewhere to land, bail out, or ditch in the channel. Many did not make it. The liquid-cooled engine was the Mustang's Achilles heel. The P-47 used the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an air-cooled radial with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing 2,000 horsepower in later variants, and up to 2,535 with water injection in the P-47M. No coolant system, no radiator, no glycol lines snaking through the airframe, waiting to spring a leak and kill you. Just a massive radial engine cooled by air passing through the cowling. You could blow out 3 cylinders, and the engine would keep running on the other 15. You could take cannon fire that shredded the cowling, and as long as the crankshaft was intact, the engine kept turning. That is not a minor difference. That is the difference between coming home and not coming home. And the pilots knew it. They called the P-47 the Jug because it looked like a milk jug, squat and bulbous compared to the Mustang's clean lines. But they flew it into hell and trusted it to bring them back, because it did, over and over. Let's talk about what that radial engine meant in survivability. The 8th Air Force lost 2,520 P-51 and 3,499 P-47s to all causes. On the surface, that looks worse for the Jug. But P-47s flew 546,000 combat sorties. P-51s flew at 213,873. The Jug flew more than double the sorties. When you calculate loss rate per sortie, the P-47 loss rate was 0.7%. The P-51 loss rate was 1.1%. The Mustang was 57% more likely to be lost per mission. That is the difference between tough and fragile. Ground attack made it worse. going down to the deck to strafe trains, airfields, convoys, one rifle round through the coolant system at 500 feet, and you had seconds to bail out or crash land. P-47 pilots did not have that problem. The radial kept running. The 9th Air Force, flying primarily ground attack, lost 1,670 P-47s flying into the most heavily defended airspace imaginable. And still, the loss rate was lower than liquid-cooled fighters doing the same missions. So why does nobody remember this? The answer is range. The P-51D with drop tanks had a combat radius of 850 miles. It could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, staying with formations the entire way. That capability made the daylight strategic bombing campaign survivable. Without the Mustang, the B-17 and the B-24 bombers would have been slaughtered over Germany. The P-47D had a combat radius of 475 miles. It could not reach deep into Germany. It could not provide continuous protection. And that is why the Mustang became the star. The mission that decided the war was long-range escort. The P-47 could not do it. The P-51 could. Therefore, the Mustang mattered more. That logic is unassailable. The Mustang was the right tool for the mission that broke the Luftwaffe and crippled German war production. But here is what that narrative erases. The P-47 did the missions the Mustang could not survive. It flew ground attack when the Mustang would have been torn apart by ground fire. It escorted bombers on shorter missions and fought off German fighters with a ferocity the lighter Mustang could not match. It carried a bomb load that turned it into a devastating fighter bomber, up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, 2 1,000-pound bombs, and a 500-pounder, or 10 5-inch HVAR rockets, or a combination. The Mustang carried a maximum of 2,000 pounds and was not optimized for ground attack the way the Jug was. The Thunderbolt was built to take the hits that came with flying low and slow over enemy positions. The Mustang was not. The men on the ground, the infantry and tank crews who called for air support, wanted P-47s overhead because they knew the Jug would deliver the ordnance and come back for more. When ground commanders needed a bridge destroyed, a train stopped, a tank column broken up, they called for Thunderbolts. The aircraft could absorb the light flak and small arms fire that made low-level attack missions survivable. The P-47 had more armor than any other American single-engine fighter. The pilot sat behind thick armor plate. The engine, already resistant to damage because of its air-cooled design, was further protected by the massive cowling. The self-sealing fuel tanks were positioned to minimize vulnerability. The entire aircraft was designed from the beginning to absorb battle damage and keep flying. The P-51 had armor, but less of it, because weight was the enemy of range. Every pound of armor was a pound of fuel you could not carry. Every bit of structural reinforcement was extra drag that reduced efficiency. The Mustang was optimized for speed and range, and survivability was secondary. That was a reasonable trade-off for the long escort mission, but it meant when a Mustang took certain hits, it went down more often. There are accounts, dozens of them, of P-47s coming home with damage that defies belief. Entire cylinders blown off the engine, oil streaming back over the canopy, and the pilot still flying, still navigating, still landing safely. Wings with holes you could put your fist through, tail surfaces shredded by cannon fire, fuselage punctured in a dozen places, and the pilot climbs out, shaken but alive, and the ground crew looks at the wreckage and cannot believe it flew. It is a testament to survivability. One P-47 pilot, Robert S. Johnson, was attacked by a FW-190 and took repeated cannon hits. His canopy was shattered and his cockpit was shredded. He was wounded, and the controls were barely responsive, and the Jug kept flying. He made it back to England and landed. When they counted the holes, There were over 200 hits, and the aircraft did not go down. That is not luck. That is design. That is what the P-47 was built to do. You cannot find equivalent Mustang stories. Not because Mustang pilots were less skilled or less brave, but because the Mustang did not survive that kind of punishment. One good hit to the coolant system, and the mission was over. You were bailing out or crash landing. The Jug gave pilots a chance. The Mustang did not. So why has the P-47 been forgotten? Part of it is aesthetics. The P-51 is beautiful. Sleek lines, bubble canopy, and elegant nose. It looks fast standing still. It looks like what a fighter should look like. The P-47 looks like a barrel with wings, bulky, heavy, inelegant. Its radial engine creates a blunt nose that lacks the streamlined menace of the Mustang's inline engine. It does not photograph as well, and it does not inspire the same immediate visual appeal. In a visual medium like film, photography, and documentaries, that matters enormously. Hollywood loved the Mustang. Post-war films used Mustangs as visual shorthand for American air power. The aircraft showed up in movies, magazines, and air shows in the cultural consciousness. The P-47, despite equal numbers, did not get the same treatment. It was less photogenic, less cinematic. Over time, that visual dominance translated into historical dominance. People remembered the aircraft they saw repeatedly, and they saw the Mustang everywhere. There is also the range narrative. The story of the air war over Europe centers on the strategic bombing campaign. The turning point in that narrative was long-range escort fighters. That is a clean story. Bombers were being slaughtered. Fighters with range arrived. The Luftwaffe was defeated. Germany's industry was crippled, and the war was won. That story demands a hero, and the P-51 fits perfectly. The P-47's story is messier. It was the workhorse. It flew brutal, unglamorous ground attack, which does not produce ace pilots or dramatic dogfight stories. It escorted bombers on shorter missions during the high-loss early period, which meant it was there when tactics were still being developed and losses were highest. It could not fly as far, so it did not become the hero of the Berlin escort mission narrative. In simplified history, it got written out. There is a deeper point about how we remember history. Narrative always simplifies. It has to. You cannot tell every story, include every detail, and honor every contribution. Choices are made about what matters and what does not. Those choices tend to favor the dramatic over the mundane, the photogenic over the utilitarian, the strategically decisive over the tactically essential. The aircraft that shows up more often in cultural memory, not necessarily in production, becomes the one people remember. But here is what the simplified version erases. The P-47 flew more missions, dropped more bombs, destroyed more ground targets, and brought more pilots home alive than the P-51. Those are facts. The Jug flew the most sorties, and it had the lowest loss rate per sortie of any American fighter in the European theater. The firepower advantage mattered too. The P-47D carried 850 caliber machine guns. The P-51D carried 6. In a head-on pass against a German bomber with only about 2 seconds to shoot before breaking off, that difference was life or death. More guns meant more hits. The Jug could put 800 rounds per minute on target. Devastating. Best is meaningless without context. Best for long-range escort? The Mustang wins. Best for ground attack? P-47. Best for survivability? P-47. Best for bringing pilots home alive? P-47. Best for absorbing battle damage? P-47. Best for missions where one hit from ground fire did not mean automatic death? P-47. The pilots themselves knew. Mustang pilots loved the Mustang. It was fast, agile, long range, and it looked good. But many admitted they felt vulnerable. One hit in the wrong place and you were done. P-47 pilots trusted their aircraft with something like religious faith. The Jug would get you home. It would take the hits. It would not quit. You could hurt a Jug, but you could not kill it. That sentence contains an entire philosophy. The Mustang could be killed with one good hit. The Jug could be hurt, even catastrophically, and still not die. That margin between hurt and dead saved lives. The narrative always simplifies. It favors the dramatic over the mundane, the photogenic over the utilitarian, the strategically decisive over the tactically essential. The P-51 had the drama, the looks, the one mission everyone agrees mattered most, so it became the star. The P-47 had the survival rates, the versatility, the toughness, the trust of the men who flew it. But those things do not make for clean narratives. Survival is not dramatic. Coming home with your aircraft shot to pieces is not as cinematic as shooting down 5 enemy fighters. Ground attack is bloody and unglamorous. And so the Jug, despite equal production, despite more sorties, despite better loss rates, became forgotten. But the men who flew it did not forget. The pilots who came home and shot up Jugs, who landed with engines barely running, who walked away from aircraft that should have been coffins, they remembered. They knew what the P-47 was. They knew what it had done for them. Many said, decades later, that they owed their lives to the Jug, and that it was the best fighter they ever flew, not because it was fastest or prettiest or most famous, but because it brought them home. So that is what gets lost. The Mustang was the better aircraft for the mission that mattered most strategically, no question. But for the pilots flying the missions, living through the flak and fighters and ground fire, coming home to fly again the next day, the Jug was the better aircraft. It kept them alive. And in the end, that is the only metric that matters to the man in the cockpit. So was the P-47 Thunderbolt the best American fighter of World War II? It depends on what you mean by best. Best for winning the war strategically? No, that was the P-51. But best for keeping pilots alive? Best for survivability? Best for ground attack? Yes, absolutely. The fact that this aircraft, produced in equal numbers to the Mustang, has been culturally erased says more about how we construct historical narratives than about the aircraft itself. History remembered the sleek fighter that escorted bombers to Berlin. But the pilots who came home in Jugs, who survived because the radial kept running, the armor kept the shrapnel out, and the airframe held together when it should have disintegrated, they knew the truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt could take anything. And the fact that nobody remembers might be the greatest injustice in the history of military aviation.